This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Dr. Diana Schaub, a professor of political science at Loyola University Maryland. Roger and Dr. Schaub discuss her recent book, His Greatest Speeches, How Lincoln Moved the Nation.
Dr. Schaub, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Diana, you are a professor of political science at Loyola University of Maryland, although I think now you're up at Harvard teaching Harvard students about Lincoln, the subject of our discussion today. And that, of course, is your expertise. You focus on American political thought and history, specifically referring to Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And then the reason why we're excited to have you today is because of your most recent book, His Greatest Speeches, how Lincoln moved the nation, and focusing on three speeches, the Lyceum Address, the Gettysburg Address, and the second inaugural. There's so much there, so we're going to focus on the Lyceum Address today. But I just want to start out by asking you about your approach, and this comes from the preface of your book. You say your book really takes the form of a commentary, and then you have this great line. You say, which is just a fancy way of saying that I'm a slow reader, and I proceed paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence. Tell us about this approach. And I don't imagine someone, being a slow reader somehow that it takes you longer to absorb content than other people. Why are you reading these speeches slowly?
Yeah, I guess it may have to do with my training in political philosophy. I don't begin as a historian, although I've had to acquire a fair bit of history along the way. So I take the ideas seriously and the form in which those ideas are conveyed, the individual words. I started by reading Plato, and when you read Plato, you're taught that, every word is important, every word is where it is for a reason, and I try to make that assumption about nearly everything else I read as well. It doesn't always pan out that things are worth that close attention, but when you find authors that are worthy of it, like Lincoln, I think the text just unfolds itself and opens itself up more and more. The more kind of humble attention you give to the ideas and the words.
Well, you certainly persuaded me after reading your book that Lincoln deserves to be read that way, like a Plato, but that is probably the exception, not the rule, with an elected leader, an office holder, writing speeches that deserve that type of analysis and slow read, or maybe not. We'll talk about Lyceum, which Lincoln delivered when he was 28 years old.
Yeah, that's right. He is, of course, remarkable, but I find that kind of close attention, there are other figures in American history who are worthy of that as well. Washington's farewell address, just a remarkable document.
Do you think it still happens today? Maybe we'll get to this at the end, but if you had to nominate someone in the 20th century that deserves a slow read, anyone come to mind?
Given your audience, I think I should say Ronald Reagan.
Ding, ding, ding. All right, good.
There's a lot to that, but I would also throw the name of Winston Churchill in there as well.
I couldn't agree with you more on Winston Churchill. We'll get to some of that at the end, but let's pick up at the start of your book. You begin with the Lyceum Address. Now, the second inaugural, that's understandable. I think you go through an American history course in high school, you'll get the second inaugural Gettysburg Address. I hope the standard practice in our schools, certainly was when I was in school, is that you memorize the Gettysburg Address, and you actually hit on that in the book. But Lyceum, why is that the one you started with?
Yeah, you're certainly right that it's the presidential speeches that people are more familiar with, and especially the two very brief ones that you mentioned. But there is this early Lincoln speech. He's very young, but it is a kind of comprehensive reflection on popular government, the dangers to which it is prone, and then Lincoln's suggestion of a solution. So it's a kind of diagnosis and treatment that he offers. And I think it's one that students still resonate with today. As soon as they read it, they're just like, wow,
right.
how did he diagnose these dilemmas and dangers so well?
Well, what is going? I mean, he chose to speak about this subject. I mean, give us the context for this speech. He's a young member of the legislature, and it wasn't like they were holding a conference in Lyceum, as I understand it, on perpetuation, were they?
No, so this was at the time of the Lyceum movement, and these were organizations really at the local level devoted to sort of continuing education. So this was called the Young Men's Lyceum. It was a Springfield institution. It had only been in existence for a few years. So sort of local dignitaries would be invited, and Lincoln was already one of those people. He was a state, Illinois state legislator. And then sometimes, visiting dignitaries, very well-known people like, Emerson would travel and speak at all of these lyceums. So it was left up to Lincoln to choose his topic. So he chose this topic, the perpetuation of our political institutions.
And why was that the issue for Abraham Lincoln at 28 years old at this moment in American history? He's obviously, if you read the speech, he's concerned about rising mobism, which perhaps you could elaborate on. And you have the tension between the abolitionists and people who support the institution of slavery, or those who just didn't support the abolitionist approach. Take us through kind of why he was seized by this concern that something was afoot here that somehow threatened institutions.
Yeah. So I think there are very broad reasons why he was interested in the topic, as well as very specific ones. So the broader reason is that he belongs to this younger generation. And so he's trying to figure out, all right, we have inherited this wonderful, edifice of political liberty. What is our task as the next generation, as the inheritors? So it really is very much a generational reflection, and this is a theme that remains present in Lincoln's speeches, all the way through. You can see it very clearly in the Gettysburg Address. What is the proper task for each succeeding generation? So there's that broad question, but then there were specific issues, and what he looks around and he sees these outbreaks of mob violence. And he sees that they are motivated really by a quest for justice. This is not just, rioting and looting, although Lincoln makes the point that
Right.
once you short circuit, the due process of law in your quest for justice, you are going to then give license to other kinds of breakdown of law as well. He sees these outbreaks of mob rule, and he gives this just amazing diagnosis of all of the results, the kind of sequence that will follow from that, eventuating in, he thinks, the alienation of affections on the part of citizens, especially the very best citizens. And at that point, such citizens will give up on the project of self-government. They will look elsewhere. They will equate popular government with anarchy and breakdown. And they will turn to the strongman or the despot. And Lincoln has an analysis of human nature that teaches him that there are always such kind of tyrannically minded figures who are lurking in the wings and ready to seize upon that opportunity to overthrow the experiment in self-government.
And Lincoln's playing with the audience here. You point that out a number of times in your analysis. Lincoln's obviously thinking about this beyond the issue of the day, but certainly the issue of the day with this tension with abolitionists and their tactics, and mobism in terms of the law not being sufficient or law and order not being present, so people take matters in their own hand, even if their principle that they're advancing might appear to be moral. Right? He's bounding it all together. But what is the audience hearing when they're trying to figure out what is Lincoln getting? Because he's talking in the abstract. He speaks in the abstract so much. The perpetuation of institutions, as opposed to just getting after it. The abolitionists need to just kind of calm down. They're self-defeating in what they're seeking to do here.
So remember, the audience that he's speaking to in Illinois is not very sympathetic. Not sympathetic at all, really, to the abolitionists.
Right.
Some of them might be anti-slavery. but they're not immediatists. They don't take the line that the Garrisonian abolitionists take, that the Constitution is a pact with the devil, and the only way you can get rid of slavery is to annul the Constitution. I mean, the abolitionists were very, very radical. So there had been a local murder of an abolitionist editor in Illinois. And you're right that Lincoln doesn't feature that. He sort of buries the reference to that. He's trying to get his audience to transcend their own most immediate and powerful passions. And so instead, he talks about incidents elsewhere in the country. He talks about incidents of mob rule in Mississippi and Missouri. And he tries to get them to follow this sequence, this logical sequence that he lays out of what the eventual effects of this are. He has to take them away from their immediate passions to see the longer term ramifications and consequences.
So we'll get to this this idea of passion and why Lincoln clearly was seized by containing it or managing it. But I want to just stick for another minute on the language. You do this so brilliantly in the book of perpetuation. Why was that the word as opposed to sustaining or building on? I mean, you really give so much credit to Lincoln for being precise in this choice of language. Take a minute just to explain why he chose perpetuation.
Yeah, so this is an example of that sort of close reading, taking that one word very seriously. So especially since he's talking about the task of the next generation. He's a young, aspiring politician, a new men, new measures. Why isn't the title of the talk The Improvement of Our Political Institutions? And there were, of course, politicians who were arguing that way. Webster, the great Daniel Webster, was always saying that the task of his generation was improvement. But then another option might be, we'll say Lincoln's a little bit more conservatively minded. Why not title it The Conservation of Our Political Institutions or The Preservation of Our Political Institutions? And it seems to me that Lincoln chooses perpetuation because it makes clear what the aim is. The aim is to cause something to endure indefinitely. But that word perpetuation is still a little more open-ended as to the means. What is the means to achieve perpetuation? Is it by utter fidelity to the past? Or is it by some project in the future, some project of betterment? And so the word perpetuation requires a kind of inquiry into how you actually achieve that and what sort of balance of fidelity to the past and action in the future is required. And I think that Lincoln's eventual argument at the very end of the speech, when he talks about the need for new pillars and this need to replace passion with reason, he is arguing that the actual way to achieve betterment is through a kind of fidelity, by better achieving those aims of the founders themselves. So that what Lincoln does is manage to link the past and the present, or the past and the future in the present moment. And that's how he's able to set forth.
So you're keeping it going, but you're allowing, perpetuating allows you to add or contribute to its perpetuation. It's not simply just conserving, if I understand you correctly, that it requires some work and development of some kind to ensure, it does perpetuate. And we'll get to the Gettysburg Address, but certainly that I'm interested in your views to what extent that's consistent with Lyceum or departure in terms of the rebirth. But before we go there, a little bit more time here on this notion of passion and why that was such a concern. Certainly mobism is one form of passion, even if people felt that there was injustice in society, but to go ahead and take law matters in your own hand is a form of passion he's concerned about. And then also, as you referenced later on in the speech, the concern about the strong man, someone solving the problems and departing from democratic institutions. And the response, of course, is this kind of political religion that he's advocating, adherence to the Constitution. Explain how the antidote to passion is reason and our institutions.
I mean, in a way, the speech has isolates two problems and two solutions. So the immediate danger, the present danger, is mob rule. And his solution to that is this political religion of reverence for the Constitution and laws. And that means for Lincoln that even bad laws, of which he is very aware, even bad laws have to be religiously obeyed until you can get them changed through the normal procedures of the law and all of the avenues that are open to democratic citizens.
Elections,
speech,
right,
press, election, assembly, petition, all of those ways to try to persuade your fellow citizens that the laws ought to be changed. But until that happens, there's a sacred obligation. So he delivers a very stern lesson in democratic theory, what it actually means to be a self-governing people, to live under laws of your own making.
It's remarkable, though, because he's also kind of wrestling with the founding of our country, which was entirely built on passions, right? And the revolution.
He doesn't say entirely. I mean, there are those principles, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. So he wants us to be aware of the principles and faithful to the principles. But what he does say is that at the time of the revolution, passion, and especially the negative passions, by passion, he always means negative passions, hatred, revenge, those kinds of things. They actually played a salutary role. The ordinary folks could, hate the British. And that furthered the cause of liberty in the new nation. His argument is that once that revolutionary period has passed, those passions become destructive rather than salutary, because they will now be directed inward. And that's what he sees happening.
And that, of course, gets to bad law, right? Whereas you had bad laws, unjust laws that were the principal reason, right, for the revolution, the form of government, the unelected. But now bad laws, which he acknowledges could be part of a democratic government or a republic like the United States, the response can be revolution. I mean, I guess he has a place for that, but go ahead.
Yeah, good. In other words, Lincoln does believe there is a right of revolution, and he thought that the American revolutionaries were justified in staging that revolution against tyrannical government. I think he believes that the extent of bad law in the new United States doesn't reach to that level that it would justify the exercise of the right of revolution. But that possibility is always there.
Right. Go ahead.
What he argues is that once you're living under laws of your own making, you now have ways to rectify those bad laws, and you must avail yourselves of those procedures. Unless and until there is a decision that the government itself is so fundamentally defective that the only response is a right of revolution. But that means a resort to bloodshed. It means war. Right.
Now, that was Lincoln's view at the time of Lyceum, right, before the Civil War. But he is, there's an undercurrent here, is my sense, that framework perhaps didn't apply to slaves or even free slaves. And right, in the sense that in Lincoln's mind, slaves weren't bound to the processes of democracy because they weren't citizens of the democracy, they didn't have the franchise.
Yeah,
is that correct?
I think that's a good question. Yes. The way I read what he says about the obligation to obey even bad laws is that applies to American citizens who have consented to the regime and are participants in the regime, so that slaves living under absolute despotism would be justified in resorting to that right of revolution. They can kill their masters in their beds, or they can try to flee.
And we'll get to the Gettysburg Address, where I think there's kind of more of an emphasis on how you change, right? I mean, in this period of Civil War, and how the structures, perhaps Lyceum, are disrupted. But perhaps that's not the way you view it.
You might say, if I could just add there, I mean, I think Lincoln believes that the Civil War came about because people did not listen to what he said in the Lyceum Address. In other words, there was a almost complete breakdown of constitutionalism in the 1850s that leads to the Civil War. But I do believe that Lincoln thought that the Constitution would have been a sufficient structure within which to address the terrible wrong of slavery.
It could have corrected. It could have been a pathway to correction short of Civil War.
Yes, that the founders, on his understanding, really had succeeded in placing slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. And the problem was that we had gone away from that framework, and that there had been various forms of backsliding and denial, really, of the founding principles, so that there had been regression.
Interesting. One other piece that came out in this discussion of bad law is a reference. We kind of jumped to the 20th century with Martin Luther King, because you kind of set up Martin Luther King as taking a different approach than Lincoln, certainly Lincoln in Lyceum, in terms of how you deal with bad law. We've just said that Lincoln would say, hey, you work through the institutions and the democratic processes to change bad law. You don't go to mobism. You don't have a revolution. There's a framework to correct bad law. Of course, Martin Luther King said, well, civil disobedience was appropriate. And in a different book, a great book that you wrote along with Leon Cass and Amy Cass, What So Proudly We Hail, it's a wonderful collection of kind of patriotic and founding writings where you pair Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail with Lincoln's Lyceum speech. Tell us about why you bring them together and what your kind of framework is for evaluating MLK next to Lincoln in this issue.
Yeah, I think that these two men are still our kind of, moral guiding lights. These are people that Americans look to. And it turns out they disagree on a very fundamental issue. Now, there's much they agree on, but they do disagree on this matter of civil disobedience. So, yes, King makes the argument in Letter from Birmingham Jail that there is a kind of halfway position between obedience to law and a right of revolution. There's this halfway house called civil disobedience. And I believe that Lincoln denies that there is that middle position available. His argument, as I understand it, is that all disobedience is uncivil and destructive of civil government.
Isn't it just a tactic, though? I mean, the civil disobedience is just another form of, I don't quite say speech, but the tools in the toolkit of how you contest, bad law and challenge the system, right? People in the civil rights movement went to jail. They paid the price, but in doing so, they demonstrated the immorality of segregation.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the argument that King makes. He argues that there is a way to reverentially break the law, that you can show the ultimate respect for law by breaking bad laws, so long as you do so in a certain way. And he sort of spells out the criteria to engage in civil disobedience. I believe that Lincoln does not accept that argument, and he believes that the long-term consequences of the embrace of that argument will be destructive of respect for law.
Yeah, it's like in his mind, it's ballot or bullet. It's ballot or bullet. Right. It's a dichotomy, and there's no space in between.
Two options, yes, the ballot or the bullet. So it is a disagreement, really, about democratic theory and the nature of citizenship. So I think it's an argument that all Americans need to take seriously. They need to put the two texts next to one another and really, really think them through. I also think, though, that it's very important to point out that most of what King does and most of what the movement does involves no civil disobedience at all. So in a way, we've come to misrepresent King's legacy by so much attaching his name to that one piece and the argument for civil disobedience. But things like the Montgomery bus boycott, that involves no boycotting. That's no breaking of a law. All the work that was done to get people registered, dangerous work, getting people registered to vote, none of that involves law breaking. Even things like Rosa Parks and the test case, to put something before the courts, because we have the practice of judicial review, that is a kind of institutionalized version of civil disobedience.
Where you could basically look at a law and say that's actually unlawful, inconsistent with the Constitution.
Because it's inconsistent with the Constitution. So because the Constitution is the ultimate authority, in the end, Rosa Parks broke no law.
Right. Well, in some ways that can harmonize.
That municipal law was null and void.
Right.
So there are all kinds of ways to do this short of actual disobedience to law.
Let's turn to the other side of Lyceum, which now I've been harping on kind of bad law and mobism and Lincoln clearly pushing for this adherence to reason over passion and the Constitution and departing from kind of the spirits of the revolution. But it seems to me where he really wants to land is something that I don't think was a clear and present danger in his day. It was more of a warning for the Republic for the future, which is human nature. And eventually there'll be someone who has ambition beyond becoming president of the United States, but actually wants to be the strongman, the leader, the Napoleon.
Right.
Where did that come from, Dr. Schaub? I mean, why is he worried about that?
Well, remember, Napoleon was not out of that's kind of within his historical moment. But he also mentions Caesar and Alexander. In other words, this timeless possibility, that kind of overweening ambition. So his analysis of the present danger, mob rule, leads him then to this prediction about future dangers, and that future danger is this problem of inordinate ambition. So the immediate solution in the moment is reverence for the Constitution and law. And then the long-term project is related, but instead of speaking of the need for reverence, the long-term solution is the priority of reason over passion within the individual soul. So if we're going to say that Lincoln was engaged in some kind of advance upon the founders or some kind of betterment, I think that's what it is. He says that, at the time of the revolution, the experiment was sort of propped up by these pillars of the passions. But now he says those pillars have really rotted away, or they've actually become dangerous to the experiment in self-government. And so we will need new pillars. And he's really pointing out, I think, that self-government in the collective really depends on self-governing individuals. And that does mean the rule of reason.
But just to make a finer point here, there wasn't anything you, as a historian, I understand you're a political philosopher, and from political philosophy standpoint, what you've just articulated makes perfect sense. But if you read a headline or a story or look what's going on within the country at the time, the historical context, there wasn't this concern of kind of the strongman rising. I mean, truly, he seems to be way ahead of his time. Or maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Because remember, at this point when Lincoln delivers his speech, he's a young Whig politician. The Republicans don't exist yet.
True.
And the Whigs were, of course, denouncing Andrew Jackson as an aspiring tyrant. So this was a commentary about Jacksonianism and kind of. Yeah, but what's interesting is that he doesn't. He makes no reference to political opponents. He doesn't make any reference to the Democrats, to Jackson, or to his successor Van Buren. Now, that was partly the expectation of the venue. When you gave a Lyceum address, it was not supposed to be, too overtly partisan. But I also think that it is because Lincoln does see beyond the kind of, momentary partisan struggles, that he's always looking very far ahead and into the future.
Who's in the room for Lyceum Address? Are these just the pencil neck elites in Springfield, Illinois? Is it about getting published in the paper? I mean, who is he trying to reach here? Is it truly going to have a national reach?
It is called the Young Men's Lyceum. So the audience slanted very much to young men in their 20s and 30s, although the Lyceum was also open to women. So I think there would have been women in attendance as well. And you're right that the result of his efforts, the lecture itself, was then published in the journal.
And he was very careful. I mean, right? And he actually italicized certain words or phrases in the speech, which kind of reinforces your approach to read him closely and slowly, to the point where that was captured in the print edition of his speech.
That's right. He was very careful in the use of italics. He employed them quite liberally, but always in a way to feature his key words and to help you really understand the sentence and the kind of pairings that were often built into his sentences. And remember, he's just writing out longhand, so he actually has to have the ability to reverse the slant of his letters so that when it's in italics.
Wow. I want to go to the end of the speech, and I think it picks up on this idea of the Napoleon-like figure, the possibility of a tyrant undermining the whole democratic project. And the hero seems to be Washington. Is that because Washington had 2 terms as president and did the unthinkable from the modern world at that time by saying farewell? And the biggest contribution he could give the young republic was to not seek office again and become a king-like figure. Is that why the speech is punctuates with Washington? There's something interesting going on there at the end. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. In so many of his early speeches, not only Lyceum, but the Temperance Address and others, even speeches in the 1850s, he will often close a speech with a kind of invocation of Washington, almost a sort of prayer to Washington. So I mean, it just is true that, at this time, Washington is the hero, still the hero, the father of the country, the only one of the founding fathers to be given that title. He is the founding father. And of course, especially in this context of an analysis of tyranny and the temptations to tyranny, I think you're right that Washington would be the key example of a person who just remarkably refuses power. Whose dedication to republicanism is that thoroughgoing, even when he had the opportunity, right, to hang on to power indefinitely. I think it also shows, in a way, what Lincoln is trying to achieve. He calls for both reverence and reason. And I think somehow in that figure of Washington, he's able to show the possibility of our reverence, right, for the founding and for a particular individual, and that reverence is not at all at odds with reason. We have a reasoned basis for our appreciation and reverence of Washington.
Is it also possibly that Washington really abhorred the passion in politics?
That too. I mean, this is a long-standing theme, in political philosophy. I mean, you go back to Plato and see what Plato said about the need for reason to control the passions. So it's sort of part of the whole wisdom literature, of the Western canon. But it's certainly true that in Washington's farewell address, he speaks so strongly against the spirit of party, and that is in a way dealing with the way the passions show up politically.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because you can't help but read Lyceum, and we're here sitting in 2022, and coming off of just a country so divided politically, and it's a politics of outrage, which is just another way of saying people are engaging in politics via passion, and perhaps reason is something that's hard to find in the discussion of politics in this country today. Um, you know, Lincoln was a partisan. Did he? And he doesn't. I don't think he treats party affiliation in the Lyceum Address. Perhaps he does it elsewhere. But tell us the place of party affiliation and the recognition that passion of the 19th century probably was as important to getting elected as it is in the 21st century. How did it all fit together for Lincoln? I mean, he won an election, he lost an election, but did he just not? He avoided it entirely. Just tell us how the politics all played in here, and elected politics and passion.
Yeah. So, if you go back to that Washington farewell address where he speaks so strongly against the spirit of party, there does seem to be a kind of hope in Washington that maybe we could do without parties or somehow transcend parties. But of course, very quickly, it becomes clear, no, we are going to live within a party system. So you could look at a speech like Lincoln's eulogy of Henry Clay, where he does reflect on partisanship. And he says, Clay was of a party, because if you hope to accomplish anything, you need to belong to a party. So Lincoln clearly embraces party affiliation, and then he moves from the Whigs to the Republicans. He's one of the first, of the Republicans, organizes the Republican Party in Illinois. But you can also see that he is always concerned to keep that party spirit within certain bounds. He tries to raise the level of partisan debate to meeting on the grounds of principle. You can see him doing that very clearly in something like the Cooper Union Address, where he tries to raise the level of the debate. He will also often speak against, he'll talk about a vote that he's given, and he says, I hope that I haven't given this out of mere party wantonness. So
basically, he didn't submit to the party whip. There was actually some principle behind the vote.
Yeah. I mean, I think you always see in he's a very principled politician who also understands the need for prudence. So I see in Lincoln just a perfect balance of principle and prudence.
Let's take a move from Lyceum, perhaps less well known to our readers, our listeners, and people watching this, to the Gettysburg Address, which is the next speech in your book, which is, of course, so well known, and I think you put it up there perhaps as the most well known speech, kind of in the world. I don't know if anything competes.
Yeah. So
there's so much to say about it, but I thought I'd just kind of enter the Gettysburg Address through the conversation we're having about Lyceum and simply ask you the question, to what extent is it a departure from Lyceum? And by that I mean Lyceum seems to be about, or is about, perpetuating, keeping it going, keeping the institutions going. And Gettysburg, because we find ourselves in the midst of the Civil War, it's all about rebirth, renewal. It is essentially President Lincoln saying that the country is forever changed, and now we have this rebirth. How do you look at it?
Yeah, I partly agree and partly disagree. I guess I would say that I think the Gettysburg Address manifests still that same combination that you see in the Lyceum Address. So there is that fidelity to the founding. Think of the opening sentence, 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So there is still that fidelity to the founding, to that nation. And he continues that through the Gettysburg Address, right? The cause for which those at Gettysburg died was to maintain that nation understood as conceived in liberty and dedicated to equality. So I think that is still dominant, that fidelity to the past. But out of that fidelity to the past emerges the possibility of a fundamental betterment, a new birth of freedom. So if you look at the first sentence, what is born is the nation. There's a new nation.
Right.
But at the end of the speech, it's not a new it's not a new and different nation. It's not a refounding in that sense, a different nation. It's a new birth of freedom. It's still somehow the same nation. I guess what I would argue is that the freedom at the end, the new birth of freedom, is now the conjoining of those two things from the founding of liberty and equality. Liberty and equality now brought into a new relationship to one another. For one thing, just expanded and extended to the 4 million slaves. So, in other words, if you look at the description of the founding, since the nation was conceived in liberty, but we do know that not all shared in that liberty.
Right.
So we were dedicated to equality. So the new birth of freedom means now the extension of that liberty to all.
Let me
equality of liberty. Equality of liberty. Let's say.
It's in some ways this is him. This is Lincoln kind of executing his notion of perpetuation, right? That you kind of have to add to it to perpetuate it. There's kind of room for kind of invention here, and the growth, which ultimately resulted in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. But what about? Okay, how do you reconcile? Let's put it this way: the Emancipation Proclamation, right, with Lincoln's notion of being true to the Constitution and the laws of the time, right? So I guess you can argue as a matter of law that it was inherent to the power of the president in the time of war, kind of that Article 2 authority to emancipate. Yeah. But that clearly was debated and not the kind of easiest read. And so it does some way depart from Lyceum and this kind of religion of being, to our Constitution.
Yeah, here again, I guess I disagree. I think that Lincoln remains a committed constitutionalist. That's what he's fighting for through the 1850s. And as president, I mean, all I have to do is look at how often he speaks of the oath and what the oath requires of him. So, you alluded to this. The Emancipation Proclamation is justified as an act by the commander-in-chief in time of actual rebellion or invasion. So his argument is that it is militarily necessary. And think of how long he waits to issue that Emancipation Proclamation. I think he doesn't believe that's just a pretext. He waits until that military necessity is clear, and he actually pursues other ways of achieving emancipation that would not have been by executive action. He tries to get the border states, the loyal slaveholding states, still loyal to the Union, to undertake gradual emancipation of slaves on their own. He believed that would have been sufficient to end the war if they had done that. So I think he's very serious that his obligation to the Union, his obligation as president of the United States to maintain the Union, is uppermost, and that he embraces the project of ending slavery only when that becomes the only way to save the Union.
Excellent. Super interesting. We have a few minutes left. I kind of want to take a step back and engage you as scholar, who's teaching students in universities, and you're coming at them with speeches from the 19th century, from Lincoln, and you make an argument in the preface of your book that Lincoln's greatest speeches matter as intensely today as when first delivered. Why?
Yeah, I think because we are still struggling with our allegiance to the founding principles. We're in a kind of position that the nation was in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where there is more and more repudiation of natural rights, with denial that they exist at all. So I think we're still very uncertain about our founding principles. I think that's the main,
and particularly
the main
on college campuses. So I mean, you have these somewhat indirect references to kind of cancel culture and this, kind of limitations on speech, that you think Lincoln is relevant to and can perhaps inform.
Yeah,
Just pull the thread on that one example.
The cancellation was on different grounds in his era. There were plenty of people who argued, we need to be sensitive to the, to the sensitivities of the Southerners. We shouldn't be engaging in so much denunciation of their practices of slavery. So Lincoln had to fight against that by opening up the space for civic discourse. He needed it to become possible to raise the question of, is slavery right or wrong? If we can agree that it's wrong, what is the proper policy to be pursued against it? So I see Lincoln as very much trying to create the space for civic discourse. He's doing that in the Lyceum Address. He's doing that in the Temperance Address. And of course, that's as much needed now as then.
And that is something that a president can lead on in your mind? I mean, is that the place, the position that matters most to provide that space?
I think Lincoln is doing it before he becomes president, but he also does it as president. At that point, as president, Lincoln is beginning to think about how are we going to incorporate the freedmen into the nation? How do we begin to talk about the vote for African Americans? He's leading the way in that. It's kind of cautiously, slowly, step by step. I think we've forgotten what an important role elected officials play in civic education. We sort of think civic education is all about, what the schools are going to do. And of course, that's important. But elected officials themselves play a key role in civic education.
Before we go to our lightning round and wrap up this amazing conversation with Dr. Diana Schaub, whose great book, his greatest speeches, How Lincoln Moved the Nation. Encourage everyone to purchase it and read it. You can get it on Amazon. I need to talk a little Reagan with you because, credit to our namesake here. When I'm reading your treatment of Lincoln's speeches, there's some Reagan speeches that I feel like I wonder what a close reading would reveal. And I'm curious, Dr. Schaub, can you take your methodology and approach, and we hit on this just at the outset, to some speeches in the 20th century? You do it with Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King in your other book. Are any from Reagan that jump out at you? You think would benefit from that close read analysis?
Yeah, sure. In other words, what I always do is sort of look at the logical structure of the argument. So a piece that I looked at from Reagan just in anticipation of our talk here was the little audio address that he gave to the March for Life. He was the first president to address them. And it was actually, did I write this down? Yeah, it was very nice how it unfolded. He began by stressing our founding proposition, right to life. Then he argued that the law ought to catch up to the science on this issue, what the science now shows us about when human life begins. And then finally, he expressed the need to care for those who have had abortions. So that's a very lovely structure to that speech.
So you look for kind of like, just to show that there is kind of purpose and intent in terms of the argument and how
it's not just random. You don't just, have a bunch of arguments that you just put, in some random order. There's an unfolding.
But do you think, for Reagan, certainly, you can't read more than a sentence of two of something he wrote or said without bumping into the word freedom, and you're constantly pulled into kind of the founding principles, if not documents themselves. Do you find that today's speeches of our elected leaders, our presidents, do that enough? There's not enough attention to
either to the founding or to just actual arguments. And I did find out this is kind of interesting. For a link between Reagan and Lincoln. Okay. He more than any other president invokes Lincoln He does so in almost 7% of his speeches. He either refers to or quotes Lincoln. It's greater than any other president. He also cited the founding fathers considerably more often than other presidents. So I think you could argue that you see in Reagan, as in Lincoln, that very much a future-oriented perspective. Reagan's kind of famous, optimism, but it's always firmly grounded in the past. So you see that same ability to link past and future in the present moment and in the call to, this generation and what we need to do.
Perhaps that's a formula of perpetuation, like we started with.
Yeah, I think you do see that in Reagan.
Let's jump to our lightning round. Fantastic conversation. Thank you, Dr. Schaub, for joining us. You shared one of Reagan's speeches just a moment ago. Favorite book on President Reagan, favorite Reagan quote, or any of those you'd like to share?
On the book, I would say the Reagan Diaries. And partly my reason for saying this is that there's nothing like it from Lincoln. All we have from Lincoln are just a few kind of fragments of reflections or drafts. So we have some famous ones like the Meditation on the Divine Will, which is a kind of precursor of the second inaugural. But yeah, I think that diary, and then also the fact that Reagan's diaries are in a way linked to early presidents who did keep diaries, like Washington, who kept a diary, John Adams did, and most famously, John Quincy Adams. I mean, he had been a diarist from the age of 7 forward. I mean, just an incredible
precocious.
But the interesting thing about Reagan is that he was apparently not a journal keeper or a diarist. He decided when he began the presidency that he made this resolution to keep a daily diary, and he kept to it. Most people don't keep
every day in office. I'm told he's the only president to do that for every day in office. Perhaps Quincy Adams may be the other, but I'm told that only Reagan did that for every day in office.
Yeah, so I think that's remarkable. Yeah.
Dr. Diana Schaub, thank you so much for joining us. Really fantastic conversation.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.